Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is our first in a series of 3 nutrition series webinars, and the topic is carbohydrates. The other 2 will be on protein and fat and hydration, so I encourage you to check out the other 2 webinars that will also be posted on the YouTube site with those topics. So here's what we will cover for carbohydrates. The role, what are the carbohydrate needs? We'll talk a little bit about carbohydrate loading and the carbohydrate needs pre, during, and post-exercise. We'll briefly discuss some carbohydrate supplements and additional resources. But before we get started, I just want to highlight that the guidelines in this presentation are for athletes and people who seriously exercise for more than an hour, usually training for some sort of an event. Recreational exercisers and people who work out 3 to 4 times a week at lower intensities will benefit from the information. However, be aware that your carbohydrate needs are not as high as the recommendations in this presentation. Okay, so first let's talk about why are carbohydrates important. Carbohydrates are the main source of energy for the working muscle, especially at high intensities. And glucose is the simplest form of carbohydrates, and it's what our cells use. During intense exercise, such as running or cycling, carbohydrates are the predominant fuel. But at lower intensities, such as jogging, carbohydrates contribute only about 50% of the fuel. And only at light activities, such as walking, is when fat is the predominant fuel. And this is because fat from fat tissue takes longer to break down for energy in the body compared to carbohydrates. And it cannot keep up with the demands of the muscles during higher intensity activities. So not only are carbohydrates the dominant fuel for exercise, but they're stored in the form of glycogen in limited places in the body. And these places have maximum capacities. So while their limit could be stretched through proper diet and exercise, there's always going to be a limit. So it is important to consume carbohydrates daily, and it's important to consume adequate total carbohydrates throughout the day around your exercise. So before, during, and afterwards, consuming carbohydrates can improve your performance, and we'll go into detail about that later. So where are carbohydrates stored? Well, as we said, carbohydrates are stored in the form of glycogen in the muscles and in the liver. And the more there are in stores before you exercise, the longer you can work out. And this is especially important for anyone training or participating in events that last more than 90 minutes. Your muscle glycogen is the biggest source of carbohydrates, storing 300 to 400 grams. That provides about 1,200 to 1,600 calories. And when the muscle glycogen is depleted, that's when you experience fatigue. So starting exercise with good muscle glycogen stores can help you work out for a longer period of time before you start feeling tired. Your liver glycogen is the second biggest source of carbohydrates in the body, storing 75 to 100 grams, which provides about 300 to 400 calories. And your liver glycogen is important for 2 reasons. First, it provides glucose for the muscles to use so that they can perform the work. And secondly, it's used to break down glucose that goes into the bloodstream to maintain a stable blood glucose level while you exercise. If your liver glycogen is low and is not able to keep up your blood glucose level, then you can experience hypoglycemia or low blood sugar. And the symptoms of that are feeling uncoordinated or lightheaded. Maybe you're not able to concentrate. In exercise terms, you may experience a crash. So now your blood glucose has a minimum supply of carbohydrates compared to your liver and muscles, about 20 grams, which supplies about 100 calories. So when exercising longer than an hour, ingesting some carbohydrates during your exercise helps maintain your blood glucose level along with glycogen from the liver. So you can see that muscle and liver glycogen stores are presented as a range and not as an absolute value. And this is because the amount of glycogen stored varies depending on your diet, your last exercise session and on how well trained you are. For example, endurance athletes tend to have higher glycogen stores than the average person. So before we determine your carbohydrate needs, let's first determine what type of sport or exercise you're performing so that we can better tell what your needs are. So this slide will help you figure out where your sport or exercise type fits in. General training sports include short distance running, swimming, cycling, sports that need stamina such as bodybuilding, gymnastics, wrestling, martial arts, those kinds of things. And your stop-and-go sports are those that require intermittent but high-intensity activities such as football, basketball, soccer, tennis. Your endurance sports require maintaining activity at a moderate intensity for an extended period of time. And those are your long-distance running or long-distance swimming or long-distance cycling. And then you've got your ultra-endurance sports, which last more than 4 hours. And this could be a marathon, maybe an extra long-distance cycling road race, maybe an Ironman or an Ironwomen competition. So now that you know your type of activity, how many carbohydrates do you need? Well, while carbohydrate recommendations for the general public is set as a percentage of the total caloric intake, for example, 50 to 60% of your total calories should be carbohydrates, right? It's much easier for athletes and much more appropriate to know how much they need in terms of carbohydrates, grams per kilogram of your body weight. The absolute amount of carbohydrate, rather than the percentage in the whole diet, is the most important measure for glycogen synthesis and exercise performance. So if you count on percentage, some athletes who don't need as many calories, such as female gymnasts or dancers who have low body weight, can end up with too many carbohydrates. And not only that, it's easier to count carbohydrate grams than to calculate your carbohydrate percentage in your total diet. But as a general rule of thumb, all athletes and seriously active people need a good amount of carbohydrates in their diets, even bodybuilders. And the amount of carbohydrates varies depending on the type of activity. So from this table, you can see that carbohydrate needs range from 5 to 10 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight. So first, let's figure out how to convert your weight from pounds to kilograms. So to convert your weight to kilograms, divide your weight in pounds by 2.2. And then, once you have your weight in kilograms, to know how many grams you need each day, multiply your weight in kilograms by the range appropriate for your training type. So for example, someone who weighs 60 kilograms training for an endurance event will need 7 to 10 grams of carbohydrate for each kilogram of body weight, right, which is about 420 to 600 grams of carbohydrates per day. Okay? So it is important to note that these carbohydrate levels must be accompanied also by total energy level. So again, you're not just eating carbohydrates, you need to get your lean proteins and your healthy fats too. Okay, well, what foods are considered carbohydrates? Well, I think the obvious ones are your grains, which is your bread, pasta, rice, cereal, oatmeal, couscous, quinoa, crackers, muffins, similar foods like that. And then you've got your starchy vegetables such as potatoes, corn, peas, beans, lentils, pumpkin. You've got your fruits, which include fresh, frozen, canned, or dried, and also fruit juices. And then you've got your dairy. Now keep in mind that not all dairy are carbohydrates. Your milk and yogurt are, but cheese is not. And then of course you've got your sugar and other sweeteners such as honey, agave, your sweets, your desserts, your junk food basically. And you really don't want to get all of your carbohydrates from this category. You want to get them more from the other healthier categories that we just talked about. To find out how much carbohydrates there are in packaged food items, your best bet is to read the label. Energy bars, cereal, snack foods, crackers, and so on are different in their calorie and carbohydrate content. So when you pick up a package to look at the nutrition facts panel, find out first what the serving size is and determine if you're going to eat a serving or if you're going to eat more or less. But then look down in the label until you find the carbohydrates. And the number next should be the grams of carbohydrates in the serving size that was specified above. The number of sugar grams can give you a general idea of if this product is mainly simple or complex carbohydrates. But in terms of carbohydrate needs and fueling your muscles, sugar grams are not as important. Just focus on the total carbohydrates. And it is also important to look at the ingredient list and make sure that there's nothing on there that you're allergic to. And also be aware that sugar alcohols such as sorbitol, mannitol, can have a laxative effect if consumed in excess. And this can be a problem, especially if you consume too much before or during your exercise routine. So now let's talk about carbohydrate loading. Carbohydrate loading is an exercise and eating plan that has the potential to double your muscle glycogen stores. Now, you don't need to follow this plan when you train. It's mainly to boost up your stores before your event so that you can perform at your highest potential. So, I mean, as we have said, with more glycogen in your muscles, you can improve your performance and endurance ability. The plan is simple and based on the theory that after your muscles get depleted of their glycogen stores, a flux of carbohydrates will trigger them to store a maximum amount of glycogen. It's kind of like overeating after being starved. It is most beneficial for endurance athletes who are engaged in intense continuous exercise for more than 90 minutes. And for the plan to be effective, the athlete must be endurance trained or used to endurance activity. In other words, it's the icing on the cake for trained athletes, but it won't do you any good if you're not physically prepared for your events. And for bodybuilders, it can increase their muscle size and improve their appearance for their competition as well. Okay, so here's the plan. Glycogen stores get depleted by two ways: intense exercise and low carbohydrate intake. So to refuel, you need to do just the opposite: rest and eat a lot of carbohydrates. And this table shows you how to do that. So to help you understand the plan, let's assume that you're running a race on Saturday. The traditional carbohydrate loading regimen requires that you exercise at a minimum at a high intensity for 90 minutes on the 6th day prior to your event. So that would be the Sunday before your Saturday event. At the same time, maintain a relatively low carbohydrate intake of 5 grams per kilogram. And then during this day and the rest of the week, while carbohydrate loading, do the same type of exercise as your event. So during day 4 and 5 prior to your event, that would be Monday and Tuesday, taper your activity to 40 minutes of high-intensity exercise while maintaining the same amount of carbohydrates in your diet, 5 grams per kilogram. And then on day 2 and 3 prior to your event, which would be Wednesday and Thursday, you further taper your exercise to only 20 minutes of high intensity. And those days you increase your carbohydrate intake to 10 grams per kilogram. To be able to achieve this high level of carbohydrates without over-consuming a large number of calories, it's best to choose low-fat meals and snacks when you do this. So now the day before your event, which is Friday, you rest completely and continue to eat 10 grams of carbohydrates per kilogram. Keep in mind that this is the traditional, commonly used plan. The drawback is that it takes a long time. It takes you a week. There is a new method found to achieve adequate muscle glycogen level in 24 hours. And that is exercising at a high intensity for 3 minutes the day before the event, and then consuming 10.3 grams per kilogram of carbohydrates along with resting for the rest of the day. So that's an abbreviated carbohydrate loading plan. So let's talk a little bit about glycemic index because it will be mentioned in a couple of the slides. So glycemic index of a food tells you how fast after eating it causes your blood sugar to increase. It's measured for carbohydrate-containing foods, since protein and fat do not contribute to blood sugar levels. So because it describes the action of a single food item, and most people eat meals that are a combination of foods, there are some limitations for regular meals. However, for athletes, it's a useful tool since they consume a single carbohydrate food, especially before or during their exercise, such as glucose tablets, a sports drink, an energy bar, or graham crackers, or something like that. But foods can have a high, moderate, or low glycemic index value. Low glycemic index foods provide a slow, steady supply of glucose to your muscles. Foods that have a high glycemic index provide a quick, fast source of carbohydrate for your muscles. And each type of food has advantages and can be used at different times during your exercise plan. Glycemic index values were measured by giving 10 volunteers a portion of food that contains 50 grams of carbohydrates. Their blood sugar levels were monitored, and they ingested 50 grams of pure glucose, and then their responses were compared. The glycemic index value is calculated as an average blood glucose response of the 10 volunteers, and therefore it can vary from one source or study to another depending on the individual's reactions. So now that we've talked about glycemic index, let's talk about your pre-exercise carbohydrates. Pre-exercise carbohydrates are any carbohydrates that you consume anywhere from 1 to 4 hours before your exercise. Now, for most athletes, a meal that provides carbohydrates before the exercise session has more benefits than risk. Pre-exercise carbohydrate prevents blood sugar from dropping, tops off your glycogen stores, helps to settle your stomach, and fight hunger during your exercise. Also, for people who exercise to lose weight, a pre-exercise snack helps you exercise at a higher intensity, which means you can burn more calories and lose more weight. Carbohydrate intake before morning workouts is very, very important. It's highly recommended that you eat something and not exercise on an empty stomach because your liver glycogen stores tend to drop during the night, and that could impair your performance and also the length of time that you can exercise. On the other hand, some athletes might experience discomfort from a pre-exercise meal, such as nausea, bloating, a heavy stomach, diarrhea, or loose stool. This side effect is more likely for athletes involved in exercises that cause shaking of the stomach, like running, compared to other activities that don't as much, like cycling. Now, how much carbohydrates you need before exercise depends on how far in advance you can eat this meal or snack. The closer your meal is to exercise, the smaller it should be. So again, here in carbohydrate requirements are based on how much you weigh. It's recommended to consume 1 to 4 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of your body weight from 1 to 4 hours before exercise. For example, if you're eating 1 hour ahead, stick to 1 gram per kilogram. But if you have 4 hours, you can tolerate 4 grams per kilogram. In terms of meal sizes, a snack is recommended an hour before exercise, a small meal 2 to 3 hours before exercise, and a larger meal if you have 3 to 4 hours to digest. The ideal timing for a meal before exercise is 2 to 4 hours. There is debate whether glycemic index of the meal or food you eat right before exercise matters. Choosing low glycemic index foods if your exercise will last more than an hour and you are unable to consume any carbohydrate during such as in a long distance swim, or if you can't tolerate foods with high glycemic index right before exercise, which happens to some athletes. But on the other hand, choose foods with moderate to high glycemic index if you missed your pre-exercise meal and only have 5 to 15 minutes to eat. So like the morning, in morning exercises. Avoid concentrated sweets like soda right before, as they can cause your blood sugar level to drop when you start working out, leaving you nauseous and lightheaded and shaky. And remember that tolerance of pre-exercise meals differ from one person to another. It's trial and error, so you're going to have to try to figure out what works best for you. But consuming carbohydrates during exercise is needed only if your session lasts for more than an hour. There are many benefits to consuming carbohydrates during your workout. It helps you run faster and for a longer period of time, helps you sprint harder towards the end, which is important for cycling, running, triathlon races. It helps maintain your blood glucose level stable during your exercise, and for stop-and-go athletes, it helps improve performance. So keep in mind that you get the greatest outcome and benefit from consuming carbohydrates both before and during your exercise. The amount of carbohydrates recommended is 30 to 60 grams every hour. Note every hour if you are training or running for longer periods of time. So examples of foods that provide this amount are a 24-ounce sports drink, a banana, a sports bar, 2 gels, 3 graham crackers. These are just some examples. Try to carry foods with you that are light in weight, such as raisins, sports bars, graham crackers, or the gels. If you prefer carbohydrate-rich drinks, you may want to hide a bottle in a bush along your route or have some friends stand there to provide your drink while you run by. Choose foods that have a moderate to high glycemic index. This is because you want carbohydrates to be quickly available for your muscles to use and for your blood glucose level to remain stable. And don't forget hydration. In hot weather, it's important to replenish your fluids than replenish your carbohydrates. Too many carbohydrates can prevent the fluids from leaving your stomach to be absorbed, which can cause dehydration. So as with pre-exercise carbohydrates, experiment with different types of foods when you're training so that you can be prepared the day of event and know what works for you. So fructose is a type of sugar found in fruits and sports drinks with a low glycemic index. Some athletes believe it's the superior source of energy compared to glucose or sucrose, which is table sugar. However, studies found that fructose is not better than glucose or sucrose. In fact, it leads to less improvement in performance. Also, fructose is more likely to cause GI distress, such as bloating or cramping or diarrhea. It can prevent your perception of exertion, which attacks your mental power. It can increase your physical stress exerted on your muscles. So, products such as tablets or sports drinks that contain only fructose as their sole ingredient are not recommended. However, if a product has fructose as one of the 2 or more sugars, then it would be better. The combination of different sugars actually enhances your water absorption and improves your hydration as well. Now let's talk about post-exercise carbohydrates. Consuming carbohydrates after your training helps your muscles maximize recovery, recovering their glycogen stores. Their carbohydrates post-exercise are especially important for athletes who work out every day or multiple times a day. Recreational exercisers who work out 3 to 4 times a week don't need to worry about it as much because their muscles have time to refuel again. Now, if your training lasts longer than 90 minutes, consume 1.5 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of your body weight immediately afterwards, which means within 15 minutes. In this case, you will need to pack a carbohydrate-rich drink or snack and have it ready immediately after. And then within 2 hours of completing your exercise, you need another 1.5 grams per kilogram. And this could be a good-sized meal after you've had a chance to shower, rest, or prepare a meal. For your post-exercise meal, the meal or snack consistency doesn't matter. It could be liquid, solid, simple, complex carbohydrates, as long as they provide the same amount of carbohydrates. It has the same effect on refueling the muscle glycogen stores. But choose foods that have a moderate to high glycemic index value, as this will maximize your muscle recovery. Okay, briefly, post-exercise protein, even though this presentation is about carbohydrates, you might wonder, because you've heard or seen athletes do so, if protein shakes and powders after exercise have any benefit. Well, there are a few things to keep in mind. Protein does not help with refueling muscle glycogen stores. Glycogen is the form of storage for carbohydrates, and proteins have nothing to do with it. However, protein right before or right after exercise may improve the synthesis of your muscle protein, and we'll talk about that more in the webinar for protein. So let's talk about carbohydrate supplements. You might wonder if there's any advantage or harm from using carbohydrate-rich supplements like gels, liquids, tablets, and bars. Here's some key points to keep in mind when you make this decision. First, your diet should be based on wholesome, real foods that are high in carbohydrates, which includes your whole grains, your beans, lentils, starchy vegetables, fruits, and dairy. Supplements can be helpful, however, if you have high carbohydrate caloric needs, such as for stop and go, endurance, ultra endurance exercisers who train every day or multiple times a day. In these cases, your carbohydrate needs might exceed your ability to consume food. That volume of food would be a lot. So concentrated supplement may be easier to tolerate in those situations. How much will these supplements cost you? Well, how many do you need to purchase? Remember that you will need to use them both during training and competition, and training usually lasts for months, if not more. Can you afford to buy the amount that you need? I don't know. It's important to have high convenience, high carbohydrate foods, but are you able to make meals at home? Do you know how to cook? Are you always on the run? What type of food is easier to pack? When do you plan to eat these supplements, before, during, or after exercise? There's really a lot to think about, and if convenience is important for you and cost isn't an issue, then, would probably be a good option for you. So you might also wonder if there's any difference between liquid or solid carbohydrates. Well, as long as they have the same number of carbohydrate grams, liquids and solids have the same effect when it comes to improving your endurance and performance. However, each has its advantages. The liquid meals and shakes pass through your intestines faster, causing minimal GI issues such as gas or bloating during the event, prevents nausea, and leaves you with low stool volume. Solid snacks, however, have a range of glycemic index values. They're lighter in weight if you need to carry something with you, such as raisins or crackers, and can help settle your stomach better. Now, whether you choose liquid or solid is up to you. With solid meals, especially at exercise time, choose something that's not very high in fiber, protein, or fat to minimize your stool size and speed up digestion. As always, experiment with your meals and snacks during training so that you have no surprises during the day of your event. So these are some useful resources if you want to read more about what to eat for exercise. Remember that carbohydrates are the main fuel for your muscles. Remember that we have limited stores of carbohydrates, and so we must replenish those on a daily basis. So it's important to eat carbohydrates every day. Eat an adequate amount of carbohydrates throughout the day based on your sport type, your body weight. Focus on critical times such as before, during, and after training. And remember that carbohydrates, not proteins, refuel your muscles to prevent fatigue. And aim to get your carbohydrates from wholesome foods first, such as the grains, starchy vegetables, fruits, dairy, etc. However, if your carbohydrate requirements are high, supplements may be helpful. So I hope that you enjoyed this topic. We covered a lot of information. And just a reminder that you can review the recording of the rest of the webinar series on the Strategic Health Services YouTube channel. But also remember that whatever your goals, Your health coach is available to support you. So thank you so much for joining, and check out the rest of the webinar series. I hope you have a great day.